Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the marketing track. So, just a few things, housekeeping reminders. Um, Make sure to check out the VR side events. They are in the agenda. Also, you can catch the Augie Awards on the main live stream on the 29th, starting at 11:50 Pacific time. And be sure to use the AWE hashtag 2020. I've already posted a couple of things there. So you should post as well. Please note that these sessions are being recorded. So anything that you're doing, like my scratching of my neck, is being recorded for everybody to see. And a big shout out to all of our sponsors, especially the titanium ones: HP, Microsoft, Qualcomm, and Unity. So next up is Unforgettable by Design. And this is Yann from Left Field Labs. And take it away, Yann.
Hello, and thank you for the introduction. So as mentioned, my name is Yann Caloghiris, and I'm Exec Creative Director for Left Field Labs, a creative technology company in Los Angeles. My background is in both making products desirable from a marketing and a product design standpoint. I've been privileged to work on a lot of interesting products, some that were on paper incredibly successful, but in practice were dramatic failures. One example here is the Dreamcast, which survived 500 days despite having many firsts, like the first online multiplayer console or the first subscription model. And one of the biggest examples for me that left a lasting impression throughout my career was the Nokia and the N95. 2007, we were launching what was going to be a flagship device. It had 128 megs of RAM. It had Carl Zeiss optics, GPS, 3D graphics, 3.5G. It had everything on paper. And it did do well. It was the class leader for 3 years, beating the Motorola Razr, which at the time was the phone to beat. And actually, if you remember that period, they were fighting each other with viral videos that were leaked online. But strangely, 5 years later, and it was a big shock to a lot of us who'd worked on that product and certainly drunk the Kool-Aid, the company was at a very different crossroad and facing complete closure. And that left a lasting impression for me. What was it that made some products so successful and some products fail so dramatically, despite being the right tool, the most advanced, the right price point? And this was just when the iPhone was coming out, and it seemed to break all the rules, right? It was highly disruptive, but somehow it achieved mass adoption. What is it about these products? What is it about these experiences that are so memorable and so compelling that they make us want to change dramatically our paradigms? And so, just to quote a bit of Kant, it's interesting to think about it, but really the way we look at the past informs the way we shape the future. And so I'm going to go through some examples that I hope shed some light into how the mind works. So this is Stephen Wiltshire. Stephen Wiltshire is a celebrated artist in the UK. He has an amazing photographic memory. The large sketch that you see him draw here was drawn by memory over 7 days after a 45-minute helicopter ride. But what I'm not telling you about Stephen is he was with autism at the age of 3. And what's interesting about Stephen is that despite some of the challenges that he has in the rest of his life, when it comes to his memory, it is incredibly capable. And to give you an example, the best memory athletes in the world can remember up to about 20,000 numbers. And actors, on the other hand, can remember 50,000 plays. And so, but he could remember 33-foot long canvas with all the details, all the windows, all the buildings, all the parts accurately. And so our memory is clearly incredibly capable. It's also very flawed. If you look at those two images, which one of you seems correct to you? Well, actually, Curious George in all the cartoons doesn't have a tail. And yet most of us would swear that Curious George has a tail. And this is commonly called the Mandela Effect, after a trend that went in South Africa where people could have sworn that Mandela had died in prison when in fact he hadn't. Another example of our memory playing tricks on us is the lady on the left. There's a number of people that are found regularly around the world with way too many pets in their properties. There's one case recently, actually, in California. A lady was found with 1,000 cats. And when the council opened the doors to retrieve the cats, they were taken aback and some were sick by the smell. But somehow this lady lived completely happily and she couldn't smell the smell anymore. She'd actually forgotten what the smell was like. And then in contrast to that, if you think of memories that are highly marked in your memories, like the first kiss, for example, you remember a lot of details. So what is it about our memory that we can sometimes cut off certain things in a dramatic fashion, and in others remember in great detail? Another interesting example is when we think about the future. So a lot of us who worked in product design or in innovation, we're constantly plotting ideas into the future. And somehow the future to us seems closer than the past. And part of that is because we have accumulated a string of memories in the past, and it seems like it's denser than the future. Another example is I was recently looking for a school for my kids, and I was compelled to pick the school on the left. And the reason is, even though it didn't score as high as the school on the right, because year on year it was progressing upwards, you couldn't help but believe or feel that that school was going to continue on that trajectory, even though on paper it wasn't as highly performing. And so this is really all to say that we have over 50 biases in our memories. There's cryptomnesia, where we mistake a memory for imagination. There is rosy retrospective, where we remember the past and think it was so much better. So our memory is highly malleable. And brands have been using this trick for a long time. If you think of Apple, they're particularly capable at this. When they're doing their keynotes, they start their keynotes with very big numbers, huge numbers. The reason they're doing this is in part to bias your opinion on the numbers that they show at the end, which is the price point of product. And so suddenly a 12-inch screen that's sold at $1,000 doesn't seem that expensive anymore. And in design, we've been using this trick for years. Why is it that the cookies on the left seem to be lighter and healthier than the cookies on the right? We're using the same typeface, we're using the same image. Well, that's another bias. We can't help but project how we feel about something based on the shape and the packaging. And really what's interesting about this is that we make over 5,000 decisions a day. So this is not really a failure of our brains. This is our ability to make decisions quickly. And this gentleman on the right here, Ted, Ted is unfortunately passed away recently, but Ted had Alzheimer's. And his son, Simon, would take him to the hospital, to shopping regularly, and was his minder. And they had a very difficult relationship where Ted wouldn't recognize his son and be quite difficult with him, except for those moments that they shared in the car, when Ted would be singing to music from his past. And for these brief moments, father and son could reconnect in these moments of complete clarity. And so there's something in music and in sentiment that makes memories so much more compelling. And again, brands have been using this and retail has been using this for a while. There's a famous study in '99 where they had two aisles, one with French wine, one with German wine. And they found that over a period of time, the wines for one country sold more than the other based on whether they had music playing from that country. And so clearly music and provenance and sentiment plays a big part in how we remember things and into the decisions that we take. And so what is it about our brains? What is it that we can learn from neuroscience as marketers, product designers, and of course, VR, AR developers? Well, we are told that we have 5 key senses, right? Touch, smell, taste, hearing, sight. But actually, that's a bit of a misconception. And I'll give you an example. If you try and close your eyes now and get very close to your nose, but without touching it, you'll find that you can get incredibly close to your nose, and yet you're not using any of these senses. What you're doing is using one of the many other senses. And experts debate that there are about 14 to 20 senses. And these senses influence and have a direct correlation to the way our neurons work and to the way we remember things. And so what I'm going to argue is that your senses, how you feel about them, is the key to unlocking lasting positive memories about something, someone, or an idea. And so our brains are these beautifully complex organic computers, as you've probably heard many times. There's over 100 billion neurons within them. And what's interesting is that the synapses, which are the junctions between neurons, produce small chemicals. And those chemicals are the ones which effectively generate emotion for us. And there are over 100 different neurotransmitters. Some of them are more famous. If you think of dopamine, if you think of endorphin, some are perhaps less if you think of serotonin, but they all are related to something that we feel and that we can understand. So for example, people know that dopamine is part of the pleasure and reward system. And they also know that endorphin relieves stress and pain. When you're doing exercise, you release a bit of endorphin. So much so that there's been a trend recently of people tattooing or buying jewelry that has the symbol, the chemical symbol of those neurotransmitters. This is an example here with dopamine. And I think what's interesting about this is we believe that dopamine is the key. And to some extent, neurotransmitters are, but it's more complicated. On the left-hand side, if you have low dopamines, yes, it's true, you might be prone to anxiety. In the middle, if you have high serotonin, it's true, you'll probably feel happier, and we can measure that and prove that. But it's actually more complicated, because when you combine dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, that's the feeling of falling in love. And it's far more complicated, and it's much more subtle than you would originally imagine. And so, in conclusion for the neuroscience bit, is you want to create something novel that captures your attention. You want to create synaptic connections so that the neurotransmitters are released. You want to have those neurotransmitters make you feel something, because ultimately that leads to long-term positive emotions. And so how do we turn those long-term positive emotions into commitment? So I might be drawn to the iPhone, I might be compelling to want to touch that beautiful responsive display, but how do I turn this into something that becomes the zeitgeist? In the case of VR and AR, and some of the companies that had such high prospects like Magic Leap, how can they convert this and turn this into long-lasting memories and a commitment from their audience? Well, I'll use the example of Michael Jordan. In 2009, he picked up an award, and it's for those of you who haven't seen it, I recommend you have a look at it on YouTube. He was asked to go up on stage and speak for just a few minutes and accept his award. You can see in his hands, he's got this stack of cards. He had so much to share. And it was an emotional roller coaster. He laughed, he cried, he fell into the pit of despair, and then he captured his audience again. And all this really came from a single defining moment in his life. He brought back the story of how in his early year as a basketball player in college, his then manager, Dean Smith, had an article interview in Sports Illustrated and mentioned 4 starters on the team, but neglected to mention him. And this lack of validation powered Michael Jordan throughout his career. After all the millions of dollars from sponsorships, all the wins, all the cups, somehow this sentiment that he had not been validated was a fuel that propelled him forwards and well into his retirement. And so when we're thinking about this, when we're thinking about designing, social validation is a key component. And we've got to be a little bit careful with this, because Sean Parker recently, who is a founding partner of Facebook, recently highlighted the exploitative nature of using social validation to get people to commit to your product or your experience. And I think as we're looking into this brave new future of AR, of AI, and all these technologies conspiring to change the world and to change our perception of the world, there is so much that we can do to compel our audiences to buy things, to change behaviors, to perhaps change a mindset or a perspective on something. And actually, I think a lot of us who either have small children or who've been working in tech for a while realize that there's a responsibility with that tremendous power that comes from the ability to frame memories and to compel people to want to do something and to commit to something. So recently in the House of Commons in the UK, for example, there is a law that's going through the House of Commons, which will be the loot boxes law. And really that refers to preventing kids from being able to get loot boxes in games because they're considered gambling. They're addictive because you can't tell what's inside them even though you've made a purchase. And in California, there's even lawmakers talking about preventing under 13-year-olds from having any social media applications on their devices or access to any of them. And actually Senator Hannah Beth Jackson recently said that she felt that the inmates are running the asylum and we need to get back some control. And obviously she's talking about social media and big tech. So I think in summary, yes, it's true that emotion, that a sensory strategy and a behavioral strategy can conspire to making products, experiences in VR, in AR, and beyond much more compelling. That I think when we're thinking about creating experiences that leverage social validation, for example, we should focus on persuasion rather than coercion. And the big difference is here is that both parties know how they're being sold to and how they're being convinced. And then finally, that if we are going to play with neuroscience and the mind, which I know we are, then maybe as a community, we should focus more on positive habit forming rather than simply selling our products and our experiences. So with that, I want to thank you so much for the time you've allocated to this talk, and please connect with me. I'd be delighted to talk further and perhaps collaborate together on some unforgettable experiences and products. Thank you so much.
Hi, Yann.
Hello.
That was a great talk. I actually have to admit, you hit the sweet spot for me. I love psychology and I love AR and VR and marketing. So, so excited. And it's not that often that you get somebody in these talks to quote Kant. That I have to say. Doesn't happen very much. Yes, exactly. So yes, now I'm gonna have to read more Kant. So talk to me a little bit. We didn't have any particular calls for questions, but I have so many. So I'm hoping that you can take the time. Tell me a bit about what brought you to sort of understand these biases and how it applies to marketing, and like what initially sparked those interests for you.
Well, I think originally it was a lot to do with coming more from an experience and advertising background and product design background from Europe, seeing how this rapid progression of apps, in the late noughties, the Facebooks of the world, what was it about them that made them so addictive? And was there something neurological into the mix? And even though they didn't advertise it openly, you'd start to hear rumbles about, the types of addictive behaviors that they could deliver on. And so a piece of me was just very curious, was this just strong UX, which is the argument we often hear, if you build something and it's easy to use,
all designers.
People will use it.
Absolutely.
Exactly. UX,
all developers,
UX.
all designers. That's the reason. It's not
Exactly.
the list of biases. That was amazing. the scrolling list of
Yeah.
biases.
I mean, it is crazy. And you know, they find some regularly, as we're finding that where consumers are using different media types, you know, there's virtual reality and there's a range of other paradigms. You know, people are finding fresh new biases we didn't know we had. So
Right.
I think this is it's very ripe territory to be learning if you're in the field of you know, designing for the metaverse and all these big buzzwords that are coming up.
Absolutely. It felt like it could be an entire day of workshops on using a particular bias and create a marketing campaign using that bias. Honestly,
Yes.
it was really great.
Thank you.
And so we were given literally like 2 minutes or 3 minutes. So thank you so much for your talk. That was really inspiring, and I hope I'm going to start digging in all of these biases, and we'll have to chat more. So
hopefully people took the point of it that it's not so much about abusing the biases to get people to use your product. You know,
it's for good, not for bad.
Yeah, positive habit forming. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Use the force for good.
And
it's the Spider-Man
that's like
quote
that person who said the scrolling. He invented the scrolling and was very upset that he had invented the scrolling. That sort of.
Or recently the plastic bag. Also heard. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I think if we, you know, for good, you have to answer. Like everything you do has to be with those two words at the end. So,
absolutely.
thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you. Nice to see you all.